Well, if you travel around Quebec for any length of time, you may have gotten used to some of the color codings that appear on some of our signs. And one of the color codes we've got as you drive around the province, along the highways, you see brown signs with white lettering. And in Quebec, those brown signs with white lettering means that there's a historic touristic site that's there, usually something with a piece of history. Near the little church in Ormstown, where I did a lot of preaching when I was in my final years of seminary, there is an old battlefield. And the battle that was held there was called La Bataille de la Châteauguay, the Battle of the Châteauguay River. And as the Americans were trying to overtake Canada during the War of 1812, they pushed through. They actually burned our Parliament buildings in Kingston, and they wanted to get to Montreal because Montreal was the gateway to allow forces and material to come into the rest of Canada. And so from New York State and from Lake Champlain and from Vermont at the same time, there were three forces that pushed their way up, and the plan was for them to meet in Montreal and attack the city and burn the city down and take control of it for the Americans. But the main force that came through got stopped at the Châteauguay River, not by the river, but by the mud pits that are before the river. Still these days, 100 and 200 years later, still these days, farmers will till their land and cannonballs and pieces of cannon come up that sunk in the mud and the mire in 1812, 1813, when they're pushing their way through. And I think I have a little map for you that shows some of the sites along the river where some of the battles occurred. Sometimes the little brown historic sites remind us of something good and positive. Sometimes the little brown signs are signs that we'd like to ignore. As a congregation, as our summer picnic a couple of weeks ago, we went to Quebec City, and we saw this little brown sign that told us about the Plains of Abraham. Slightly less fortuitous battle. On the 13th of September, 1759, the British made their way in, and on the gentleman who owned the farm, his name was Abraham, that's why they called the Plains of Abraham. The battle was held on the fields in his farm. It overlooks the river, just between what's now Chateau Frontenac and the river, and on that plain was held this battle. The British had pushed through, and it is that decisive battle that ended New France and brought all of North America at that point under British rule. It is not a fortuitous battle, and there is a deep and hurtful irony of history that our legislative parliamentary buildings for French, Canadian, Quebec is a stone's throw from this battlefield that reminds us that we were conquered by the British. If you've ever wondered, our license plates in Quebec say "Je me souviens," and it's a quote from a poem from a French-Canadian author who says, "I remember that though I was born under the fleur de lis, I was raised under the British rose." And so I'm French at heart, I'm French in culture, I'm French-Canadian at heart, but we got conquered by the nasty British, and they still control the place. And so you've got this place of great irony and sorrow for many Quebecers and many French-Canadians that this battlefield is there, marking the end of French culture and French control of North America. Well, we have today one of the pivotal moments in the book of Joshua. And after today, they don't put up a brown sign with a name on it. They put up a pile of stones as a historic memorial marker. And it doesn't remind them of a battle that they waged. It reminds them of a battle that the Lord won single-handedly, and it's a positive thing. We're just going to read our way through Joshua 4 tonight and into the first verse of chapter 5. I'll make a couple comments as we go through, and then we'll pause at the end for a bit of reflection. So Joshua chapter 4, and starting at verse 1. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, you remember what happened last week? The Ark of the Covenant was carried by the Levitical priests. When their toes touched the water, the Jordan waters split. They went to the middle of the river, and the people passed on both sides of them, hundreds of thousands of them, passing on dry land. When all the nation finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight." So they're going to take these 12 stones, one stone for each of the 12 tribes, take them out from the middle of the Jordan River, and make a little pile on the other shore to where they had crossed. Verse 4, then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man for each tribe. And Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each one of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel. So they're big stones, they had to carry them on their shoulders, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it passed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of Israel, just as the Lord had told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. And, verse 9, and Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. Now, there's a question here. It's not clear, and there's a little bit of debate about this. It sounds like there's 2 piles of 12 stones. It sounds like Joshua got the 12 men to take 12 stones from near where the priest stood in the middle of the river, to carry them to the edge of the shore, to make a pile of stones, and then to take 12 stones from the edge of the shore and to bring them back and to make a little pile where the Levites were standing in the middle of the Jordan. Now, we have a problem with the Hebrew. It's not always easy to figure out the tense in the Hebrew. In English and in French and Spanish and Portuguese, you can tell whether you're in past tense or present tense or future tense. It's not as easy to do in Hebrew. They don't conjugate the verbs the same way. So you have to tell whether it's present, past, or future tense often just by the context that you're in. So as we look at these 2 possible piles of stones, some Hebrew scholars think that no, this is the same 12 piles, but it's just the way Joshua's telling the story that's a little confusing. And then there's a second group of scholars who make an interesting suggestion. They say that what Joshua did is they picked 12 stones at random around the Jordan River bed. They brought them, they made a pile first at the feet of the priests, and then when they're ready to go, they took them in a second step from the feet of the priest out to the edge of the shore. So we don't know which one of the 3 it is, but it is a remote possibility that Joshua, in fact, went one step further than what God had asked him. God had given him instructions to make a memorial pile of 12 stones on the edge of the Jordan, and it sounds like Joshua may have said, God, I'm going to do you one better. Here's the pile of 12 stones on the edge of the Jordan, and just so remember this day, somewhere, apparently in the middle of the Jordan River, under the water, there's still a big pile of 12 stones. I mean, they were still there at the time Joshua was written. I don't know if they're still there today, but we'd have to see. Verse 10, for the priest bearing the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded him. The people passed over in haste. And when all the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priest passed over before the people. The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. And the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests bearing the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests come up out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up on dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. Now the story tonight is wonderfully symmetrical. There's a bunch of symmetries going on in a way that really emphasizes the miraculous. You remember when the priests went in, as soon as their feet touched the edge of the water parted. And then when it's done, on the other side, when they step out, as soon as their feet touch the dry ground on the other side, the water comes back. So it's nice symmetry in the way the story goes. But it also destroys some of the leading secular explanations of what's going on here. Because some people are uncomfortable with the miracle that the Bible clearly claims happens. Like, well, they got there in the spring and the water overflooded, and when the water overfloods the banks, sometimes there's an area that's dry, and so they looked, they found a spot where the water was dry, and that's where they crossed. But this is another way. The priest came in. There was water, their feet touched, the water parted. When it's all done, they step out. As soon as they step out, the water comes back. This is not circumstantial, accidental. This level of detail stresses the fact that there's an eyewitness account that this is the way it happened, and clearly it happened by the power of God. Verse 19. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. If you remember the book of Exodus, and if you know the Jewish calendar, these dates should mean something to you. It's as if I was telling you, I want to meet you for coffee on December 24th. You would say, sorry, I can't meet you for coffee December 24th. This is Christmas Eve. I'm busy with family. Okay, this is the eve of the Passover. I told you before that one of the reasons why God had them crossed when he crossed, even though it's a spring, and even though the Jordan is at its widest and fastest flowing, that they were coming in the spring at that point when the spring harvest had started, when they're going to get through to the other side. There's going to be grapes, there's going to be fruit, there's going to be vegetables, there's going to be wheat ready for them. That was one reason for the date. But this is the second most important reason for the date, just at the time of Passover. And there's this neat symmetry here that happens in the text. Do you remember when they left Egypt? Remember the order of events? They're in Egypt, they celebrated Passover, they left Egypt, and they crossed the Red Sea. Now they're doing it in reverse. They cross the Jordan, they get into the Promised Land, and then they celebrate the second Passover. So the two Passovers, 43 years apart, from Passover 1 and Passover 2, and the events are like on the other side. Verse 20. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Chapter 5, verse 1, which belongs to this piece, really. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they'd crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As a preacher, one of the difficulties is that both Sunday morning and Sunday night I'm in the pulpit preaching, and I don't often hear other pastors preaching. And so one of the things I do during my spare time, often when I'm working in the office plugging away, I'll get cassettes and tapes and I listen to other preachers preach. And I love listening to Martin Lloyd-Jones, one of the great preachers of the last century. And he had a couple things I don't have. He preached much more slowly than I did. It would be easier for some of you to understand him. Except that he preached in this heavy, thick, beautiful British accent. And I like the cassette, the recording of when he speaks on this text, because he's got this good, heavy British accent, and he reads from the King James. And this question that the children ask from the King James, and I can hear Martin Lloyd-Jones say it in his heavy accent. He goes, "What mean these stones?" And he's got this powerful, reverberating voice. The question sounds almost like catechism, doesn't it? I don't know if some of you have grown up doing catechism, but you know that question and answer, the way we learn the Westminster Confession or the confession we've been going through on some Sunday mornings. We ask a question and there's a response. There's a neat incident. B.B. Warfield, who was one of our great Presbyterian theologians, tells a story of an American Army officer. And he was posted overseas, and he was in a big European city. There was rioting going on, and the American Army was there trying to keep peace and trying to keep things under control. And in the middle of the crowd and the rioting, the general is looking for another couple soldiers to work with him to kind of quell the riot and calm the crowd and dissipate things, send people away. And And in the middle of this chaos, there's a couple of young officers that step up and help him to sort of bring peace and calm to the crowd. And there was one other young man in the crowd that he was really impressed with. And after the crowd had dissipated and peace was restored, he went over to see him, and he had this hunch. And Warfield tells us that he pointed to the young man's chest like this, and he just asked him a question. He had a hunch about him, and he pointed to him and he says, "What is the chief end of man?" That's the first question in the Westminster Catechism. And without missing a beat, the young man responded, "To glorify God and enjoy Him forever." And the general said, "I knew it. I knew that you were a good man who had been raised on the Westminster Confession, the way you just acted in that riot. I knew you were a solid, faithful, young man who knew the confession." So this sounds like the beginning of a catechism. What do these stones mean? And there's a response and there's an answer. Now that process had occurred before. It wasn't the first time in the Old Testament. In the book of Deuteronomy, about 7 or 8 times, when God gives the law to His people, several times He tells His people, "You will teach your children when you're walking on the way, when you're sitting at the table, when you're putting them to bed at night, when you're traveling, when you're in the field, when you're at home, when you're around you'll teach them." And you'll teach them these things, and they'll ask questions. And then around the Passover table, this has grown into a full-blown thing that happens now. If you get to celebrate the Passover at a Seder meal with a Jewish family, it's now developed, and there's this little ritual, and the youngest child in the family is the one who gets to ask the question. And as the meal unfolds and the lamb is brought out and the bitter herbs are brought out, the child asks, "What is this? What are we remembering? What is this for? What is this about?" But here, God wants the children to see the stones and to ask the questions. When your children ask you in time to come, "What do these stones mean to you?" then you will tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the Lord when it passed over the Jordan. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. The question is short. And the response is relatively surprisingly short, but it packs a bunch of things in it. And I've got a list of about 12 to 13 things that brought forth these significant things in the crossing of the Jordan and the memorial stones, these 7 or 8 things that God does that He packs in this one event and in these 12 memorial stones. And in the answer that they give to their children, they say, "This is the moment that we crossed into the promised land. This is the moment when God fulfilled His promises." And so when their children ask them, what does this memorial mean? You're going to tell them this wasn't an accident. It wasn't just at the last minute we were wandering, we were looking for a place to go, and we saw, "Oh, look, there's a nice place. Let's hop across the river and camp there." This is God brought us here because God had promised this. These 12 stones mean that God keeps His promises. He's powerful and He's promise-keeping and He loves our people. And as He promised to Abraham, as He promised 40 years, as He promised during 400 years of slavery, He fulfilled all of those promises and He brought us here. At some point, I want to talk to you again about the bones of Joseph. There's a neat line in Hebrews 11 when it talks about the faith of Joseph. He says, "By faith, Joseph asked not to be buried in Egypt with the glory of Egypt." Joseph was second in command to Pharaoh, and the Egyptians loved him, and they wanted to build him a big tomb like King Tut, and Joseph said, no, my bones are going home. And there's a line in the text that says that for 400 years, when the children of Israel were in slavery, they looked at Joseph's bones, at this little box with Joseph's bones, and they said, "One day we're going home, and we're going to take Joseph's bones with us, and we're going to bury Joseph in the promised land." And we'll see when we get into the Exodus, one of the first things they do at some point when they get settled, Joseph gets buried in the promised land. So these 12 stones, it's not just, we found a nice place for a picnic, we crossed the river, and we found our new farmland. It says, no. God kept His promises. That's what these 12 stones are about. The second thing that the 12 stones say very, very clearly, you notice that the response is, God cut off the waters of the Jordan. It's passive for the waters. It doesn't say that the waters stopped. Somebody else cut them off. It wasn't because it was spring and it was a time for the river to go in another direction. It wasn't because it was dry in the winter and it was time for it's not something the water did. The waters were cut off. Somebody cut them off. Somebody did something powerful. Some external force stepped in, cut off the waters, and then made them flow again when it was time. It was a clear manifestation of God's power to his people. As they sit on the edge of the promised land, and there's big cities, and there's Jericho, and there's Ai, and there's all of the powerful nations that are there that they're going to have to encounter, and they're wondering, can God do this? And God says, yeah. You want to know what I can do? Watch the water of the Jordan. But it's not just the people of Israel whose hearts were filled with fear and awe of their God. Number 3, the surrounding people were also filled with fear. And this is very important, because the people of Israel are going to do something very, very counterintuitive. They've crossed over into the promised land, and then in chapter 5 next week, they're going to do 2 things that God wanted them to do right away. First, they're going to celebrate the Passover. And the Passover, it takes 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, because on a day you have to pick the lamb, you have to find a lamb in your flock that's without blemish. You're going to watch it for 40 hours, make sure that it's okay. Then there's a process of preparation. You've got to prepare the meal, you've got to get rid of the leaven, you've got to do all of that. It's 4, 5, 6 days. And then Joshua's going to have to tackle something important for them, part of their cultural tradition, part of what God instructed them to do. All males had to be circumcised. But for the last 40 years in the desert, they had not circumcised anybody because they were walking through the desert. And you don't want to get circumcised and be walking in the desert for days on end. And so for the last 40 years, nobody's been circumcised. So at the end of chapter 5 next week, after taking a week off to celebrate the Passover, they're going to circumcise all of the adult male, including all of the fighting men. And after you've been circumcised, you don't want to go anywhere. You don't want to get out of bed for a few days, and you especially don't want to have to pick up your sword and go heavy into battle. So, strangely, for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, Israel are going to be sitting ducks. And you think, God, it would have been better to do Passover before crossing the Jordan. It would have been better to do the circumcision before crossing the Jordan, it would have been safer to go that way. God says, no. He says, first, step of faith, crossing the Jordan, you're going to the promised land, stake your ground, and there you celebrate the Passover, and there we redo the circumcision, and it made them sitting ducks. So it was important for all of the surrounding people to be scared enough of Israel that they wouldn't attack during those 3, 4, 5 weeks. So while they're sitting there doing the Passover, doing circumcision, the people are talking. The word is spreading. It took them a while to cross the Jordan. In the same way that there were spies from Israel who went into Jericho, I think we can assume that there were spies from the other nations that were following this people. I mean, it's a couple 100,000 people. You can't miss them. You can see them from a distance. I'm sure that there's people who are watching, and you see how very quickly the word spread. Can you imagine the guys who were sitting up on the hills, watching 700, 800, 1 million people sitting on one edge of the Jordan saying, all right, this is going to be interesting. Let's see how many of them can swim. And all of a sudden, this box carried by priests in white comes out of the crowd, touches the end of the river, and the river opens. That had to be pretty impressive. I'd love to hear the reports that the spies gave to their bosses back home when they said, you'll never believe what I just saw. You'll never believe what just happened. And so God did it this way, powerfully, because he needed to keep those people at bay, those foreign countries at bay. The fourth thing that happens, and it came across very clearly, Joshua's leadership is affirmed for the people. This is Joshua's first big test. I remember when I started as new pastor at Cote almost 11 years ago now. As ministers, there's this thing they tell you when you start in a new congregation. Don't try something hard right off the bat. Because if you try something hard and you fail, you have blown your chance to make a first impression. So they say, tackle something small, like we need to replace the carpet in the nursery. We need to raise, $73 to replace the carpet in the nursery. Like don't start with a $3 million building project your first week in the congregation. Start with $72 to replace the, and then you're going to raise $72 to, and then in your third week, all right, we got our first victory. We raised, $78. We replace, you got to start with. Well, Joshua didn't start with something small. His first task was getting all of them across the Jordan River. And you see the results in the hearts of the people. They're ready to follow Joshua like they had followed Moses. But it wasn't just for Joshua. It wasn't just for the people. It was for Joshua himself. Imagine how Joshua felt after the crossing of the Red Sea. We talked about this before. When God says, thanks, Moses, you're done, step aside. It's because Moses had failed. And imagine Joshua trying to step in. You're filling Moses' shoes, and Moses got replaced because he lost his temper and he blew it, and he's not going to enter the promised land. And that's when you step in, because the hero, favorite leader that's always been there made a mistake, and he had to be replaced, and you're the guy who has to step in. So the way the Red Sea is crossed, and then the making of the memorial, the instructions are given to Joshua, and it's Joshua who leads the way in this celebration, in this affirmation. It's number 5, Joshua's leadership is affirmed. Number 6, and this is sort of a strategic military statement. When you've seen that flag of the American Marines planting the flag on Iwo Jima. You've seen that, the statue of the guys coming in with the flag. And I'm a Lego fanatic, for those of you who didn't know. And about a week ago, somebody sent me this really neat picture of an almost life-size replica statue entirely made out of Legos. Pretty impressive, of the Iwo Jima. Israel has now crossed into enemy territory. It's land that doesn't belong to them. They cross the Jordan. They go up onto the first big plateau. They called it the Plains of Jericho at one point in our story. It's the plateau surrounding Gilgal. And this will be their military beachhead. There's 3 big plateaus from which they'll work and begin their attacks and their military operation and where they'll settle. And this big plateau around Gilgal is one of them. And when they come there, and they put this memorial pile of stones, there was no Israeli flag yet. There was no Jewish flag with the blue Star of David. There was none of that yet. But this was about as close an equivalent as you can come. This is not their land. This is not their territory. They're invaders. They're coming into a foreign land. And the first thing they do is they make this memorial pile of stones. And it says, we're here. This is ours. And not only are we here, but get this, in generations to come, our children and their children and their children are going to see this pile of stones, and they're going to ask questions. They're saying, we're here, and we're here to stay. Because one day our children and our grandchildren and their children will be here, and they're going to see this pile of stones. This is like planting a flag, saying we're here. And the 7th one, just the last one I'll give you tonight, there's this memorial factor here at Gilgal. Over the course of the history of Israel, before Jerusalem is set up, there's 3 spots that will be holy religious sites for them. There's Gilgal, there's Shiloh, and there's Shechem. But Gilgal is the most significant. There's a number of things that are going to happen here. Here on the plain at Gilgal, they're going to celebrate the first Passover and do the circumcision in chapter 5. In chapter 9 of Joshua, they're going to build the first sanctuary, the first altar. It's like their first church. It's going to be significant. The first place in Israel where God will be worshipped, and it will be built here at Gilgal near this pile of stones. When Samuel begins to offer the sacrifices, he will do most of the sacrificing here at Gilgal. When Samuel is a judge in Israel, this is where he will work. When King Saul in 1 Samuel 11 becomes the first anointed king of Israel, he will be anointed king at Gilgal, at this site, we think, with the 12 memorial stones still there. Now, unfortunately, as the human heart does, we manage to twist everything. And we get to the end of the Old Testament in Hosea 9 and 12 and in the book of Amos in chapter 4 and 5, and we discover that Gilgal had become a center for idol worship. Regrettable that this memorial that should have been forever in perpetuity a reminder to Israel of that moment when their God, the real God that they worshiped, who had taken them out of Egypt across the Red Sea, through the desert for 40 years. He had parted the Jordan River for them. He'd established them here. He had that memorial to that. They forgot what it meant. And they began to use the place. They began to use the place to worship other gods and foreign idols. I have to tell you, when I read the story, the most significant thing for me is the way the question about the stones are worded. It doesn't talk about a big Sunday school lesson to 300 kids at a time. It doesn't talk about, it doesn't say, on Sunday mornings from here on in when, your preacher speaks, he's going to preach to you as, about this. Joshua makes it very, very personal. And in fact, he switches to the singular. He says to the people about the 12 stones, he says, when your children, first person singular, when your children ask you, and get this, he doesn't say, what do these stones mean? He says, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean to you? Very, very personal. There's 700, 800, 900,000 people who've just crossed. The rivers of the Jordan have parted over. There's this big military undertaking. There's all of this. The whole nation is here. All of the nations around are afraid. There's all of this big, deep, heavy international significance over, centuries of God fulfilling his promises of. But Joshua stops and he says, there's a pile of stones here that marks this event. And one day, your children are going to ask you, what do these stones mean to you? We need to find these personal moments in our spiritual lives where we stop, we make a little pile of stones, maybe we take a picture, maybe we put up a Facebook post, I don't know. Maybe we add a page in the scrapbook. There need to be these moments of victory, of triumph, and of progress in our spiritual lives where we stop and where we put a marker in, where we put a red dot, where we put a little flag, where we put a file of stones and we say, here, God did this for me, and that's what this means to me. And it needs to be public enough that your children and people around you stop you and they say, wait. What does this mean to you? And you have a chance for a conversation about the goodness of God, about his power, and about what it means to you. Amen.